All right, hi everyone. I hope the volume is better on this presentation. We're going to talk about the war in Kansas, as well as some other items. Um, in a way, the Civil War started in Kansas in 1856 when fighting broke out over the admission of Kansas to the Union. And this became really a critical factor in basically crystallizing the sectional divides in the United States at this time. So, sectional politics, as I just mentioned, crystallized really with the crises of the mid 1850s and late 1850s that we're going to talk about here. President Franklin Pierce was elected in 1852. And after the defeat of the Whig Winfield Scott, who is also, like Zachary Taylor, a hero from the Mexican-American War, you will, in the course of the 1850s, really in the course of the crisis over Kansas, see the formation of the Republican Party. The Republican Party is really a microcosm of the sectional politics and the sectional problems of this time. So key figures like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, the great compromisers who were last involved in the Compromise of 1850 over California, after these individuals die, the Whig Party was sort of in disarray, and there was a lot of other competing smaller parties, like the Free Soilers, for example. And the Republican Party really founded itself on various tenets that were taken from all of these other parties, from the Whigs, the Free Soilers, the Know Nothings, and even some Northern Democrats that were angry over Kansas-Nebraska. Would join the Republican Party, and the Republican Party becomes a truly sectional party. The Democrats at this time are not a sectional party. There are Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas from Illinois. There's many Southern Democrats, obviously. The South was far more Democrat exclusively than the North, but there were Northern and Southern Democrats. So the Republican Party is really the first sectional party. And its creation as a response to these controversies over Kansas-Nebraska and the Dred Scott decision really enhance and crystallize this divide in the United States, the divide over slavery, over federal power, over states' rights, and especially, of course, expansion and the movement of slavery into new territories. So this is a map. This is circa 1856. This is a map of the United States kind of depicting the pre-Civil War sectional divide. The free states, of course, the northern states and the free states are, of course, in red. The slave states are, of course, in the gray. Kansas and Nebraska is this area in the middle, and it is, in this kind of yellowish natural color of the print. And, of course, you can see the line that draws through the unorganized territories in green. And that line, of course, is the Missouri Compromise line. When you look at this, you certainly can see some of the issues with the South. The North had increasingly, and you'll see this changing, of course, but the North had increasingly sought to, at the very least, maintain the 3630 line and prohibit slavery from new territories. The South, of course, wanted to continually expand the territories that could decide one way or the other, free or slave. And it's obvious by looking at this because there's clearly many more territories in the West that would be coming in as free than slave. And so you will see, Southerners increasingly champion the idea that slavery should be able to expand, slave states should be able to expand their influence into the new territories, and that becomes really at the heart of some of the disputes over Kansas-Nebraska. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act actually was largely a product of Stephen Douglas, who you see pictured here, and Stephen Douglas was an Illinois senator. Is really involved wranglings over where the Transcontinental Railroad line would go. The United States obviously had not constructed a transcontinental line, and the process for constructing it was very much occurring at this time. Of course, the transcontinental line would be finished in 1869. Well, the debates were whether it would be a southern route or a northern route, and of course, you wanted the transcontinental line to go through your section because it would enhance the commerce and trade and economics. The southern route was probably the most feasible. It was the easiest to go over. It was, in some cases, the most organized. There was the least amount of unorganized territory in the southern route. The Gadsden Purchase, which is actually the little very bottom portion of Arizona. It's a small area of land with really just open land. It's desert. It's nothing of great value. But it was purchased, and actually Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, the future Confederate president, was the one who was actually sent to purchase the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico in 1853. The issue with the northern route was that territories, particularly Nebraska territory, was not organized, and there were a lot of problems with conflicts with Native Americans. It was an unorganized territory. The solution for people like Stephen Douglas, who desperately wanted a Chicago railroad terminus for the economic benefit of his state and section, was to organize it. And so to organize the territory meant that you would have to encourage migration to the territory, and you'd have to encourage the Nebraska territory to create governments and propose constitutions. Well, of course, as soon as you open up this issue of a new state coming into the Union, you have the issue of whether it would be slave or free. Because, of course, particularly for Southerners, they had been fighting very hard to maintain this balance in the Senate in which they would have enough pro-slavery or Southern-friendly states in the Senate that would allow them to always protect the institution of slavery from a president and a House of Representatives that could be representative of free areas of the country. So this would be a huge problem, and Stephen Douglas understood this. And so Stephen Douglas, in trying to achieve this issue, proposed something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act was basically said that Kansas-Nebraska territory, or Nebraska territory, would be cut in half. The northern half would be Nebraska, and it would be free, and the southern half would be Kansas, and it would have slaves. It would be a slave state. Of course, this was a big issue because it threatened the Missouri Compromise, which had said that no territory above the 3630 line, basically the southern border of Missouri, could be admitted as a slave state. The federal government had banned slavery effectively above the 3630 line. Well, Franklin Pierce, who was typically pretty sympathetic with the South, drove this through Congress to the opposition of a lot of who we're now going to be calling Republicans. They drove this bill through Congress, pledging that Kansas would be a slave state, Nebraska would be a free state. It seemed like the best route for a guy like Stephen Douglas to organize the territory of Nebraska, but also prevent continued controversies like the one they had over California. However, it produces, in a large respect, it produces the Republican Party, but it also produces an even more enhanced sectional politics in the country, and it's far worse than the crisis over California and the Compromise of 1850. The violence that it will erupt over Kansas will be quite thorough and chaotic. Before I move on and talk a little bit about the situation with Bleeding Kansas, I want to talk about something else that's going on for Southerners. You remember this map that I showed you momentarily? You could see that if you abided by the 3630 line, which of course the Kansas-Nebraska Act, it's basically nullifying the 3630 line, and by the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The 3630 line will be pretty much wholly found to be unconstitutional by the court headed up by Roger B. Taney. However, Southerners in the 50s, because of this limitation of new possible slave states, Southerners went to kind of great lengths to find potential new slave territories. The United States was very deeply involved in Central America. We had obtained a treaty with Colombia that guaranteed us the right to use the isthmus to develop a transcontinental railroad line across the isthmus, which wasn't long. It's 48 miles. This is basically where the Panama Canal was built. William Walker, Southerner, who was born in Nashville, Tennessee, pictured here. William Walker actually went into Central America and the Caribbean, doing what they called filibustering, not the same as in politics, but he went to Nicaragua and tried to. He made himself president of Nicaragua. He was the technical president of Nicaragua from 1856 to 1857. He is ultimately fought and defeated by the Central Americans, and he was executed by firing squad by the Hondurans in 1860. But William Walker, and this is a map. This is William Walker's map of Nicaragua territory. William Walker very much wanted of a number of Southerners who wanted to find new slave territories to bring into the Union, and many of them looked to the Caribbean and South America. Nicaragua was particularly a desirable location because of Lake Managua, the big lake you see there, which there were, during this time period, significant movements to try to build a canal there. There's also initiatives on Cuba, and Cuba, of course, the island just off the coast of Florida. Cuba was part of the Spanish Empire. And Franklin Pierce administration, they had actually toyed with something called the Austin Manifesto, which suggested that Pierce administration would make an offer to buy Spanish Cuba, and if they did not, that the Pierce administration would actually try to take Cuba from Spain by force. Very controversial, and of course the Pierce administration scrapped the idea after it was leaked. But it was another idea. Well, maybe we could go and create a new slave territory in Cuba. These were all in attempts to insulate the southern section. These were attempts to insulate the southern section, which really defined itself through the institution of slavery. Here's another image, Central America. You can see where Nicaragua is. So after the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed through the Franklin Pierce administration, there was a lot of animosity and anger from anti-Southern advocates in the North. There was the New England Immigrant Company in New England that encouraged people to migrate from New England to Kansas as anti-slavery advocates. Many of them were sent with breech-loading so-called Sharps rifles. Jayhawkers moved into Kansas to try and manipulate Kansas's future. So what the northern anti-slavery forces were trying to do is they wanted to increase the anti-slavery population to such a degree where that when the state began to organize its government, that they could elect anti-slavery people to the government, and that those anti-slavery people could then effectively, through popular sovereignty, which popular sovereignty means that the people should be able to dictate the choice, free or slave, of their state, that the people could then, through that government, vote to move Kansas out of the kind of southern slave support area. And Southerners were increasingly upset by this because they felt, as was the case, that Stephen Douglas, a northern Democrat from a non-slave state, they had assured them that Kansas would be a slave state and Nebraska would be a free state, despite the fact that very few slaves populated the territory. So as it so happens, there's going to be an organized vote for the state Congress, the legislatures of the state. And to prevent what they fear might happen would be that because there's very few slaves populating the territory, because New England Immigrant Company and groups like this have been trying to encourage people to migrate to Kansas, to build the anti-slavery population in the state. There's going to be a vote in the state Congress, and Missouri Senator David Atchison, in an attempt to prevent Kansas from voting in an anti-slavery legislature that, despite the clause that Kansas should be a slave state, could pass legislation, could create a constitution that would nullify that. So Missouri Senator David Atchison encouraged pro-slave border raiders and illegal voters to cross into Kansas from Missouri in droves, in thousands at times. And these groups raided people, they terrorized people, and they held the election amid an atmosphere of terror and fraudulent voting, situations in which you had places where 200 people lived and there was 2,000 votes for pro-slave. This results in two separate governments created. The first government was the Lecompton government, and it was a pro-slave government. It was the first government. It was the government that resulted from this vote that David Atchison's border ruffians, as they were sometimes called, had basically encouraged at the point of a gun. This was theoretically the legitimate government. It was a result of this process, and it was an incredibly fraudulent government. The basis for which it had come to power was on illegal votes and terror, basically. The Lecompton government had proposed a very harsh enforcement of slave rules and laws that included the death penalty for supporting abolitionary movements or supporting abolitionary activities in the territory, in the state. The other government was the Topeka government, and this was the anti-slave government, and it was created by anti-slave advocates in protest to the Lecompton government. So you have two governments in the South. You have two governments in Kansas. Kansas descends in 1856. Kansas really descends into a state of kind of guerrilla warfare, in terror warfare, in which some 200 people were killed in 1856 over this. It began with violence on both sides. On one side, you had the pro-slavery forces sack the city of Lawrence. The anti-slavery advocates who were protesting, if you will, the pro-slavery government refused to fight. They chose not to resist lest the situation deteriorate. And so the pro-slavery forces were basically allowed to attack Lawrence unabated, and they plundered and destroyed and looted the city. At the same time, Charles Sumner, who was a senator from Massachusetts, in response to things like the sacking of Lawrence, spoke, and of course the border ruffians that were raiding from Missouri, Charles Sumner, the senator, spoke very, very with great anger against the Southerners, and in challenging quote-unquote Southern honor, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, actually, imaged here in a lithograph image, Preston Brooks caned Sumner almost to death. He hit him on the head with, it had a gold handle on the top of this cane, and Charles Sumner was beaten. I mean, he was hit some 30 times, and he had to go to Europe at one point for special treatment. He had psychological issues. He continued, and he would remain in the Senate until the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, but he spoke with a lisp. It very much affected his quality of life, as he would have suffered, what we would call today a head injury. John Brown was an anti-slavery advocate, and John Brown was equally kind of stirred up by what he saw with the sack of Lawrence, with what he saw with the caning of Charles Sumner. And John Brown, who was John Brown was the father of 20 children. He was a very, very religious man, and he became kind of he was a fanatical anti-abolitionist, he's a fanatical abolitionist. And he promoted fighting fire with fire. He promoted, using the force of terror and war against the pro-slavery advocates. John Brown was very much mentally unstable. John Brown would, after he heard about the caning of Charles Sumner, after he heard about the sack of Lawrence, and these types of things, John Brown very much, he would fly off the handle and become, very, very emotionally irrational. John Brown and several of his followers carried out what was called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre in May of 1856, in which they attacked a handful of unwitting pro-slavery individuals that had not been involved in recent murders that John Brown was seeking to avenge. But John Brown and his followers captured them, and they basically killed them execution style, more or less, with broad sabers to the head. So it was a brutal kind of killing. The Pottawatomie Creek Massacre is kind of adding fuel to the fire to this sectional violence from the South and from the North that's kind of descending on Kansas. So Kansas falls into a sort of guerrilla terror war. And these sectional issues are increasingly enhanced by the coverage of these events from Northern and Southern journalists. Take, for example, the caning of Charles Sumner. In the North, it was very much presented as an act of utter Southern barbarism. In the South, Preston Brooks was praised as a hero for uplifting Southern honor. So it becomes an increasingly violent situation in Kansas and becomes a microcosm of the sectional dispute in the country. After Kansas begins to stabilize for a period of time, after 3 to 4 governors had gone in and they had failed, and they had sought to bring it under control and they had failed, eventually the Kansas crisis is brought somewhat under control. And after it's brought somewhat under control, the Lecompton government, still the same government, called a fraudulent convention to create a constitution for the state to put before Congress. The Lecompton Constitution called a convention, and the convention was basically going to establish a constitution that would then be voted on. The critical officials in every avenue of this are pro-slavery officials, and the Lecompton government represents about 1/5 of the population. So it's anything but democratic. And the governors who had come to the territory to oversee this stuff had increasingly recognized this, and there were governors from the North and there were governors from the South that all seemed to recognize the fundamental non-democratic nature of what was happening in Kansas as pro-slavery advocates increasingly tried to fraudulently control the situation to their own benefit. So the Lecompton Constitution proposed, this convention proposed a constitution that would be with or without slavery, which on surface, sounds fair enough. Fine, let's vote on it, even though the chance of having a fair vote at this time was a pretty far stretch, because they hadn't had a fair vote yet. Every time there was a vote called by the Lecompton government, the anti-slavery people would refuse to participate in it, fearing that if they participated in it and it lost, it would give credence to the Lecompton government. They also refused to participate in it because they pretty much knew that all these elections were going to be rigged with illegal voters in one way or another. And so it was basically a one-sided constitution that was proposed. The Constitution said that if you vote for it to be without slavery, it would give unlimited protection to slave owners already in Kansas to protect their property rights. And the big issue for the anti-slavery side of things was, what do you do about people who bring slaves illegally into the territory? Under the Lecompton Constitution, any slave that was brought into the territory would automatically be an authorized slave, regardless of whether or not they had come in there illegally or not. The Constitution was put before Congress, and actually President James Buchanan, who is pictured here, regarded as one of the worst presidents in the country's history, if not the worst. And historians believe they put him in that category largely because Buchanan Buchanan did not have the gumption to really stand up to the issue when he really needed it. And this was one example of this. President James Buchanan had originally, and even though he was voted in largely by Southern votes, President James Buchanan had, as president, said he would not support the Lecompton Constitution. He had to flip-flop, or at least he felt he had to flip-flop, and he turns to support it. And of course, the reason that he felt he had to do that is fear. James Buchanan thought, if I don't support this, the Southerners are going to either secede or start a war. And he was trying to do anything he could to kind of placate the South and prevent that from happening. Stephen Douglas was outraged and actually expressed his outrage directly to Buchanan. He's outraged not necessarily because of slavery or free. It was originally Stephen Douglas who said Kansas should be a slave state. But Douglas believes fundamentally in what will eventually be called his Freeport Doctrine, and that is the idea that the people in the states, regardless, should be able to decide through popular sovereignty whether or not a state was free or not. He was angry because it wasn't democratic. It was rigged in favor of pro-slavery, and he believed that if the populace there was majority anti-slavery, then the state should be a free state, regardless of what had originally been said in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Senate, of course, passes Lecompton. The House literally fought over it. There was one night, there was a melee on the floor of Congress. It's hard to imagine today such an event happening. It doesn't pass. Lecompton doesn't pass. And between this, Kansas will descend again into war as factions fight over trying to determine which direction the government will go. There's going to be a number of various types of governments that are offered. And eventually in January 1861, Kansas, before the war starts, Kansas is brought in as a free state. Now, of course, at that time, you can really get a feel for just how tense things must have been. I mean, January 1861 is a couple of months before Lincoln's going to be inaugurated. It's in the midst of the beginning of the secession crisis. Your deep South states had seceded. So you can really see how Kansas, and the fighting in Kansas remained intermittent at this time. And so you can really kind of get a feel for how in Kansas the Civil War in a lot of cases was happening, and in a lot of cases the issues that caused the sectional crisis that led to the Civil War really crystallized and came together over Kansas. And very much the country, North and South, free, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, descended on Kansas and attempted to use Kansas as a way of charting the future in terms of freedom or slavery in the nation. Last thing I want to mention, I do want to mention the Dred Scott decision briefly. This is another significant factor, especially when you couple it into the Kansas-Nebraska Act and what the Kansas-Nebraska Act asserted about the 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise line. So, of course, you guys probably know, I'm sure you guys have heard the story of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave whose master took him to the north into places like Illinois. And ultimately, Dred Scott, after being really encouraged by white friends of his from Kansas, he was encouraged to sue for his freedom. It was not an unprecedented case. Slaves had successfully and unsuccessfully sued for their freedom in places like Kentucky. So this was not, it was not completely unheard of. However, the Dred Scott case goes up to the Supreme Court of the country, and it becomes a case that Roger B. Taney, who's a Chief Justice, a conservative Chief Justice from Maryland, that Roger B. Taney wants to make the decision that kind of characterizes the court's position on the constitutionality of major issues in the country at the time. The decision was made that Dred Scott could not sue for his freedom. That Taney made the decision, or he didn't make the decision, but he wrote the decision. He wrote the precedent that the Fifth Amendment provided protection of private property, even when it's illegal in another state. So Scott had no right to sue for his freedom, and Scott could not be a citizen. This is despite the fact that, in the founding of the United States, in the founding of the Constitution, that in some states, I think there was 5 of the early states, slaves did participate and vote on ratifying the Constitution and so forth. But in terms of federal citizenship, an African American could not be a citizen, according to Tawney. Scott had no right to sue for his freedom. The big one too was that the Missouri Compromise was, according to Tawney, unconstitutional, in that Congress did not have the right to ban slavery from the territories. The reaction to that was a very significant development, and of course it encourages Stephen Douglas, the Illinois senator, to begin to develop his Freeport Doctrine, which promotes popular sovereignty in the new territories. But the Northern reaction is largely to A, ignore the court ruling, and to B, further kind of assert, a kind of sectionalist position on the issue. This is really what gave Lincoln his kind of early political claim to fame. Lincoln even asserted a conspiracy over the issue with the Supreme Court and James Buchanan and Stephen Douglas, and Lincoln famously came to the assertion that that a house divided cannot stand. That Lincoln said that the country can't remain part free and part slave. And Lincoln was a free soiler. He was opposed to slavery, and Lincoln begins to assert that the country is going to have to, slavery is going to have to end ultimately. And so you can see now how the Dred Scott decision, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, these types of things are really adding a very significant amount of fuel to this fire over sectional politics and slavery and the question of new territories and new states. So you can really start to see the animosities and the anger developing towards the Civil War. I hope this helps. I hope it's clear, guys, and let me know if you have any questions.